Everyone, welcome to tonight's presentation. I'm Susan Moore, President of Friends of the Salmon River. And as you know, tonight's presentation is invasive Phragmites, how to identify it and what to do about it. And tonight, Amanda Tracy will be presenting for us. This presentation will be recorded, and in a couple of days, the link will be sent out to all of you so you can share it with others, or people can watch it as their leisure. So you know, we did, of course, previously have our winter speaker series, and recordings of all our speakers in that series are available on the Friends of the Napanee River YouTube channel and on both of our websites. Tonight, if you have any questions during the session, please use the Zoom chat function, the bottom right of your screen, to type in your questions or your comments. Direct your questions to everyone, and we'll ask your questions at the end of the presentation when Amanda is done. If you wish to turn on the closed captioning, go to the bottom right of your screen where it says live transcript. Go into that and hit subtitle settings, and you will see the all the text of the presentation of the event tonight all typed in at the bottom of your screen. There we go. So there's tonight's presentation, and in a couple of minutes, Amanda Tracy will, of course, be coming on to give you all her expertise about invasive Phragmites. Anyone who wishes to either take out a membership or give a donation to Friends of the Salmon River, there's the info for you. You can go on our website using credit card or PayPal, or you can contact our treasurer, that's Dave, at the email address below. And you don't have to be scribbling all this down. You can just go on our website and find all of that if you wish to. So we know that invasive Phragmites is taking over our wetlands and our beaches, and it's really destroying habitat of many species, including turtles, frogs, and snakes, and also wetland birds. And you can see the photograph on the right, that Phragmites is really a huge mass of roots. And that is why it settles in so badly and is so difficult to get rid of. And we really need citizen input here to help us. So we decided we wanted to do a whole Phragmites campaign, and we got funding from the Invasive Species Center, which of course was extremely helpful for putting on this campaign. So the first phase of our campaign is the reporting, of course, so that we know where the Phragmites is in the watershed and how much we have of it. And Amanda will be telling you a fair bit about that. And phase 2 is tonight, learning more about how to identify it and how to manage it. And lastly, phase 3 will be the field work, and Amanda will briefly touch on that tonight, how to remove Phragmites and restore those sites so that the habitat is much better for all of our species. So we have Amanda Tracy coming on tonight, as I said, for to give us all her expertise on invasive Phragmites, and I will introduce her now. Amanda Tracy has a PhD in biology from Queen's University. She's a coordinator of conservation biology for the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and that's the Central Ontario East area based out of Napanee. Amanda's responsible for the stewardship of Nature Conservancy properties in the Napanee Plains and in the eastern Lake Ontario coast natural areas. She's a certified Ontario wetland evaluator, which of course will come in awfully handy in the in talking about invasive Phragmites and how it affects wetlands. Amanda's active with the Kingston Field Naturalists, especially as a leader with the Kingston Junior Naturalists group. She's a director with Friends of the Salmon River, a partner of the Lennox and Addington Stewardship Council, and she's really helpful to both our groups. We're often calling on her for her advice. And she's also, as if that's not enough, a water ranger, meaning that she helps with water testing in our watershed. So I am going to turn this over now to Amanda Tracy.
Awesome. Thank you, Susan. I'm just going to make sure I share this properly, Susan, before you go off mute. So let's see if I can do this. How does that look? Good? Can you see that, Susan?
Yes, I can see it fine, Amanda.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining us tonight. I often say when I talk about invasive species that it's unfortunate that we have to talk about them, but I do love talking about them because honestly, there's just so much that we can learn. I'm constantly learning new things about invasive species, and I love to share things about invasive species with others. So tonight, we're really focusing in on invasive Phragmites. And so I wanted to start just quickly as a reminder to folks. So we're going to talk quickly about what an invasive species is, their sort of general impact of invasive species, and then move strictly into Phragmites. So talking about identifying it, differentiating it from native Phragmites, because that exists as well, how it spreads, how to control it, how to report it, the next potential Phragmites, which might be something new for folks, and then also what can just the average person do about Phragmites. So starting off just very broadly, what an invasive species actually is. So there's a couple of different definitions here because they do differ depending on where you look. So according to the Canadian Council on Invasive Species would be defined as a non-native species whose introduction or spread negatively impacts native biodiversity. It could also impact the economy and or society, which could also include the health of humans. And then another way you can look at invasive species is looking at non-native species. So non-native species in particular refers to any plant, animal, or microorganism that has been accidentally or deliberately introduced into areas beyond their normal range. So what that really shows us is that not all native species are, all non-native species are invasive. So you can have non-native species, it's just a plant or an organism of some kind that exists outside its normal range. But invasive species, you have to have those extra sort of impacts there. So we have the negative impacts to biodiversity, the economy, and to humans as well. And sometimes you hear invasive species referred to as alien species, introduced species, or exotic species. But invasive species really is the best way to capture them in regards to that definition there. And also, again, invasive species can be anything. So just by my nature of my training and what I'm interested in, I'm a plant person. So when I think invasive species, my mind automatically goes to species like this unfortunately stunning flower that you see here, purple loosestrife. I always think of plants, but I have to remind myself invasive species come in all forms. So you can see here like the rusty crayfish and the well-known emerald ash borer on the bottom there as well. And the impacts of invasive species, so it's so widespread and there's so many different things and the different impacts can interact with one another. So there's so many ways that invasive species negatively impact biodiversity, humans, and our economy. So reducing food and habitat for wildlife is probably one of the biggest ones. And it does that it sort of connects to the second point there, so about reducing native plant diversity. So a lot of invasive species take up space that native species would normally take up. And a lot of our animals, our insects, our pollinators are adapted to having native plants available to them as food sources. So when we have invasive species that take over that area and start outcompeting the native ones, then we see decreases in food for things like, say, aerial insectivores. Those would be birds that eat insects, for instance. So the impacts kind of cascade through the food chain. We can also see human health issues. I'm thinking particularly of species like wild parsnip, for instance, that or giant hogweed that might cause like pretty serious sometimes reactions to skin. They can reduce the yield of crops. So we're seeing more and more species, especially Phragmites, actually growing into wetter areas of farm fields and taking valuable resources away from crops. Some species can endanger livestock or just impact the quality of livestock in general. I read something once that said that cattle that actually eat garlic mustard, which is another invasive plant species, sometimes their milk can actually come out with a faint like garlic taste or scent to it. So it can cause issues with livestock as well. Some of them are actually toxic to livestock, some invasive species. And also reducing forest regeneration. So again, increased competition. You have more species taking up space of young trees and taking up resources from young trees. So it can really have a negative impact on that. And many invasive species are also able to completely alter the soil chemistry. So they can make the soil essentially inhospitable to any plant except for their own species. So the impacts, again, are just so widespread and across the map. And putting a dollar value on it sometimes also helps visualize it better. So all of these numbers here came from this really great report that I have at the bottom. So it's called Estimated Expenditures on Invasive Species by Ontario Municipalities and Conservation Authorities. Invasive species, they cost a lot of money. That is what it boils down to. So it's important that we learn about them and learn to deal with them. So now we're up to our the start of the show tonight, which is invasive Phragmites, or otherwise known as European reed, common reed, or sometimes just common reed. And Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada actually called invasive Phragmites Canada's worst invasive plant. And if you look at the date down there, it says 2005. And I personally think that Phragmites has come a long way in terms of being even more invasive than it was in 2005. So that says a lot that in 2005, they thought that this was the worst invasive plant. I can only imagine what if they knew it was going to take off like it has today. And you can see a really dramatic but accurate photo of it there on the right-hand side. You can see just how massive this plant can get. So just introducing everyone to invasive Phragmites. It's a perennial grass. It grows up to 5 meters tall. So like I said, it's quite large. Native to Eurasia, and it's not entirely clear exactly how Phragmites got here. It's debated quite a bit. It's likely that it was unintentionally introduced via soil ballast on ships, but it's also likely that it could have been intentionally introduced as well via horticultural trade. So you can see this picture at the bottom here. It is a stunningly beautiful plant, especially once it goes to seed, but that doesn't necessarily outweigh the negatives of it, and I hope I can convince people of that tonight, but that just goes to show you why people would have wanted to introduce it horticulturally. And its habitat, so it grows quite in a number of habitats now, so really broadly in all types of wetlands. So it could be in swamps, we see it in marshes, we see it in fens. It also grows in just other kind of wet-ish areas. So it doesn't need standing water. It can grow on dry land. So often on roadsides, ditches, the edges of agricultural fields, as I was saying. So it's quite expansive in terms of the actual habitats that it can thrive in. So now we get to identifying invasive Phragmites, and I'm just going to quickly go over it because after this I'm going to compare it to native Phragmites. So invasive Phragmites, you can see in the right side on the picture here, has beige stems that are quite rigid. So if you take a stem of Phragmites and you bend it, it's very likely that it's going to snap. So they have a lot of rigidity. Its leaves have kind of a blue-greenish tone to them. So, and that's hard to see when you don't have it immediately beside something that's not bluish green, but it's not like a bright or a dark green. It's got a very blue tone to it. It has very, very big fluffy seed heads, seeds that are dispersed by wind. And then it grows in really dense monocultures. Like you can see in that picture there on the right-hand side, all those stems that are growing. I mean, within 1 meter squared, there would be hundreds of them. So it grows very dense. So imagine being like a turtle or a frog or a marsh nesting bird like a least bittern and trying to get through that density of stems. That would be quite the task. So as I was saying before, native Phragmites is, we do have a native species of Phragmites as well. So Phragmites australis subspecies americanus, and it is different from invasive Phragmites. So I put a little chart together here to help sort of differentiate between the two types. So they have sort of the same overall look. They get tall, they have leaves that sort of grow. This picture actually really does a good job showing you. It has leaves that grow at a 45-degree angle. But there are differences. Sometimes ones that are more minor than others. And there are other differences than are captured in this chart here, but I chose the ones that would be most obvious and easy to use for people to identify on their property. So the first one is that the leaf sheaths drop easily versus adhere tightly. So if you can take a look at that, again, that leaf that's pointing off of that Phragmites stem there, this is actually a native stem, but look right where the leaf joins the stem. So if you were to try to pull that leaf off, if it was native Phragmites, it would come off a lot easier than it would if it was invasive Phragmites. Native Phragmites is also often, and I say that with a little asterisk beside it, because often it's mixed into communities. I'm seeing more and more that are not, that might look more like a monoculture as well, but generally they grow with other things. And generally, invasive Phragmites grows as a monoculture. Now, if you are looking at a relatively new invasion of invasive Phragmites, it might not be at that monoculture stage yet, but those are two sort of general differences. Native Phragmites generally has a very smooth and shiny stem, whereas invasive Phragmites, the stem is really rough and it's quite dull. And I'm going to show a couple of sort of important pictures as a follow-up to these in a second. And the native Phragmites stem is also, especially in the lower half, quite red and purple, whereas the entire stem of invasive Phragmites is a dull kind of green-brown color. Native Phragmites, again, this goes back to that color of foliage. So if you see them side by side, the difference is really actually quite striking. Harder to tell when you only have one or the other, but you get that blue-green tone out of invasive Phragmites, and then you get a kind of lighter yellow-green kind of foliage out of the native Phragmites. These ones are getting a little bit more nitpicky, and sometimes you might need a hand lens to look for them, but ligules, if you look at sort of where the leaf attaches to the stem, and the glumes on the seed heads tend to be longer in native Phragmites, but shorter in invasive Phragmites. And again, that's really hard to measure. It's only different by, the matter of millimeters. So even when I'm in the field with a ruler, that's a tougher one to use. And then the flower head is a really sort of key one. So the native Phragmites generally has a very sparse flower seed head, whereas invasive Phragmites has a really dense, fluffy seed head, like that picture I showed you at the beginning with the big white plumes. And again, invasive Phragmites has that rigid stem, it'll snap. If you try to bend native Phrag, it's quite flexible, so it often kind of springs back. And native Phragmites tends to be less aggressive than invasive Phragmites does. So those are some sort of key differences there. And there's some really great resources from the Invasive Species Center and other groups about how to differentiate. And this is sort of a summary that I put together of all of those resources. So here's a really great picture to show you sort of the seed head. So you can see the invasive one on the left here and the native one on the right. So there really is a substantial, there's a substantial size difference between the two of them. And there is a great picture of the stem as well. So you can see the invasive has that dull sort of green-brown stem, and the native has a, at least in the lower parts, a very reddish tinge to the stem. So how does Phragmites spread? Well, it spreads in a couple of key ways. So the first one being seeds. So I love this picture here on the right-hand side. You can see this really white fluffy. So if you imagine like what a dandelion seed looks like, it has this white pappus that's attached to the seed that helps it disperse in the wind. You can see that same type of seed in the Phragmites seed head here, with each one of them, like there are thousands of seeds on one plant here. And so the seeds are spread by wind. They're spread by animals. So because they're fluffy, and including humans, whenever you walk through, like, your lawn, you let perhaps you're practicing no mow May and your lawn is full of dandelions. When you walk through there, you're going to get dandelion seeds stuck to your pants and to your shoes, and then you could move those to the next location that you wear those shoes in. So the same goes for deer or rabbits or whoever's using your yard. They will all help move these seeds around. They move good seeds of good plants around, but they move the bad ones of bad plants around too. Because Phragmites is often associated with water or wetter habitats, the seeds can move in water as well. So if they're on the edge of the Salmon River, for instance, they could wash down and land on dry land somewhere else. And then also human activity is a big one. So humans participating in activities in the water. So whether, like, you could be in a canoe or a boat, you could be driving an ATV down a trail. All of those things, you can get seeds attached to you or attached to whatever you're using, and then you can move them somewhere else. So seeds is a really major way that Phragmites spreads. The other way is via parts of its root. So rhizomes and stolons. So rhizomes are essentially like underground stems. So if you can imagine that, they're connected to the parent plant. So the plant that sort of is the mother of them all, they're connected underground to them. And these stems are capable of growing new plants. So when a piece of a rhizome breaks off, so a fragment of it breaks off, it may wash down, like the river, for instance, to a new site, or it could be moved via humans with construction equipment is a big one. Other sort of roadside equipment, ATVs, boats, things like that, they can move them further along as well. And again, I just mentioned at the bottom here, so development, more development in recent years has certainly increased the number of roads we have, which then increases how connected the landscape is, and that facilitates, movement of seeds and rhizomes to areas that weren't previously invaded, as well as other human-induced changes. So shoreline development, for instance, may promote the invasion of Phragmites because it leaves really large open spaces free of competitors. So something like a species like this that's capable of growing so fast could move in so quite easily. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about controlling invasive Phragmites. And I always come back to this in every invasive species talk I give, is talking about the best management practices. So for many of the most aggressive invasive species in Ontario, Ontario has established best management practices, which are really, really fantastic, well thought out, comprehensive documents to help people understand how to manage invasive species. And so and this is sort of a summary straight out of the best management practices here. So the first thing you need to do whenever you identify an invasive species on your property is you need to think about developing a strategy for management. So you want to take a look at the site and actually evaluate it, think about the size of the invasion, where it is, just sort of get your bearings straight. And then you want to work on defining what your management goal is. So what ultimately are you trying to do? Do you have a few stems of Phragmites that are starting to move in that you want to take care of? Do you have, is it a big invasion and this is going to be like a large scale habitat restoration project? Is it that Phragmites is blocking a sight line on a corner of a road and therefore it's a safety issue? So what is the goal in managing Phragmites? And then you need to start setting your priorities. So this could include any number of things, especially if you have multiple invasions in multiple spots. One of the big things often with priority setting in invasive species is you always want to tackle the satellite ones first. So the isolated individuals are more important than the large group because that's what's going to start a large group elsewhere. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then you need to think about what you actually want to do. And that's where the best management practices really come in handy. And again, I'll talk about that in a second. And then continuously thinking about monitoring. So no invasive species management is like a one-shot deal. I mean, I'm sure there's some magical case of that somewhere, but often it requires continual monitoring and then eventually also some sort of site restoration as well. And I apologize that this is really blurry. I, for some reason, could not get it to come out any higher quality, but this is an example of one of the tools that the best management practices have. So it helps you, there's various flowcharts and various other resources that help you prioritize. So depending on population size and other important features of your property, it helps you determine how best to manage that population. So there's so many different ways to manage Phragmites, and often a lot of these control methods need to be used in combination. And there's actually several more control options outlined in the best management practices, including things like mulching, prescribed burning, etc., that I chose not to include here. I chose to include and focus on the ones that the average person at home can do themselves, although really that's only a couple of them, and you'll see why in a second. So before I go into those, just talking about on the right here, a few different control considerations. So things you want to think about before you actually try to control Phragmites. So one is, how dense is it? Like I was saying, do you have 2 acres of solid Phragmites, or do you have 2 individuals of Phragmites? Does it go across, like I said, across 2 acres? Does it go across 5 acres? Does it go across, the side of your patio? How disturbed is it? So a lot of invasive species really thrive on when areas are disturbed. So is it somewhere where you're going to have a lot of foot traffic or a lot of vehicle traffic, or is it somewhere that's fairly quiet? What's the risk of reinvasion? So how did it get there to begin with? If you have let's say, I don't know, a canoe launch or something on your property where you're always putting your canoe into the water and that's where the frag keeps popping up, well, you probably have a fairly high risk of reinvasion in that exact spot. So it's important to think about the reinvasion risk and how it got there, and that connects below to the vectors of spread. So how is it getting there to begin with, and is the work you're doing going to actually address that vector of spread in particular? Another one to think about is the seed bank present. So when you're dealing with really large scale or large populations of Phragmites that have been there for years and years, they're continually, every year that they go unmanaged, they're putting more and more seeds into the seed bank. So if you have a new invasion, you probably have, not necessarily, but probably have a lower amount of seed in the seed bank. And again, wetness too is a big one, and also goes along with wetness is differences in water levels over the course of a growing season. So is it consistently changing over the growing season? Is it always dry? Is it always wet? Something to think about there. And then of course, local species at risk is a big one as well. That's often overlooked. So control timing for Phragmites depends on the control method that you're going to use. But you also have to be really aware of species at risk that may be in the area. So if you have a bit of frag starting in your marsh and you know you have marsh nesting birds there, you might want to try to target your control to after their nesting season has ended. So I'll start, I won't go in order of this list because I wanted to start with a couple of control methods that are sort of less likely to be used by the average person. So like I said, I didn't include mulching and prescribed burning, mainly because those two need to be often used in conjunction with something else for them to be successful. And often that something else is chemical control. Keeping in mind that chemical control has to be done by somebody who's licensed to do so. So a licensed exterminator has to do the chemical control. Chemical control can be done on both dry land and as of this year can also be done on populations in water as well. There's a new herbicide that was approved for overwater use in Canada. However, like I said, it has to be done by somebody who's licensed to do so. So that's not really something that is available to the average person, and you'd have to hire a contractor who is able to do that. The same kind of goes for flooding. So flooding is only really effective in areas where the system can be easily manipulated. So if you had somewhere where there was a dam, for instance, or like just somewhere where you had some way of changing water levels, flooding could be really, really effective. So early in the growing season, you could put a bunch of water in there, which would prevent the Phragmites from being able to grow. But again, the average person just doesn't have the capacity to do that. So the other three are 2 different selective cutting options, and then a revegetation option, which is a newer option included in the update of the best management practices. So the original ones were from, I think, around 2010, and they did an update of it in 2020. So selective cutting and spading is likely, on land, is likely the one that most people are going to be able to participate in. So what this does is it actually, you're taking a spade or some kind of cutting device and you're cutting it just above its rhizome. So either right at or slightly below the soil surface, taking care to not disturb the rhizomes, because as I said before, you get a small fragment of that rhizome, suddenly it could be moved anywhere else and you're starting a new population, you don't even realize it. So selective cutting and spading on land can be quite effective because what it does is it reduces the capacity of the plant to actually photosynthesize. So it deprives its roots of energy. And the ideal time to do this is later in the growing season. So it can be just before the seed heads produce. Sometimes that's not possible just with timing. In which case, if you could only sort of cut it once in a season, it would be just as the seed head was emerging. That would be the ideal time. Not when it has mature seeds, but sort of just as it's coming out. And that's largely because that's when most of the resources are up in the above ground biomass of the plant. So not most of them, but a lot of its energy is in the upper parts of the plant. So that's when you're sort of going to be able to give it sort of more of a knockout punch instead of just a little jab. So that is one really effective way on land. You can also selectively cut and spade in water though. So frag tends to be growing in either dry land or straight water. It can grow in areas where the water level changes, but I tend to see it in those two. So selective cutting and spading in water, or it used to be referred to as cutting and drowning. So you would cut the Phragmites below the water level, which again would cut off its sort of access to energy and resources and would essentially deprive it of oxygen and kill the plant. Often this can be successful, but both of these, in fact, the one on land and water, are quite labor intensive. So, you know, if you have a large group of people with access to hand tools or brush saws even that you can cut under the water, that might be a good option. But we often run into the problem of just not having the labor, and you need sometimes big machinery because they're just so big. So it really depends on sort of the scale of the invasion that you're dealing with. And then the other option that we have now is revegetation. And this can kind of link in with the site restoration, so sort of like the after control, but it can also be used as a control. So it's more of like a cultural practice where you're essentially, once you know that frag is growing somewhere, you can plant a bunch of other fast growing plants, shrubs, things like that to sort of take up space. But often it's best to use that in conjunction with something like light cutting, and that's what I will be talking about in a second when I talk about a case study that Friends of Salmon River has been doing at our Beaver Lake. So in terms of disposal, you always need to check your local guidelines. You can burn the stems of Phragmites. The seed heads, it's recommended if you have Phragmites where you have those big, like the big fluffy seed heads out, that you do cut them off and bag them, and that's something that we've been doing at Beaver Lake as well. And then you can let these seed heads sit in black plastic garbage bags and basically kind of solarize, so the heat of the sun will kill the seeds, and then you can dispose of them according to how the municipality would ask you to. So I encourage everybody to check out those best management practices and read through all the different control methods. If you have frag on your property, each method talks about the ideal timing and the ideal location for those treatments. So it talks about size and density of the populations in particular, and it helps you choose which one is the best for your situation. So this is our Beaver Lake site here, and we started this project, I want to say, in 2019. The last few years just kind of seemed like a blur with the pandemic, but I believe it was in 2019, and this is located just right at the park on Beaver Lake, so right at the Lions Club Park there. And this is growing sort of right at the edge, mostly on dry land. So what we've been doing is practicing that sort of a combination of techniques, really. So often, logistically, we ended up doing it later in the season. So what we've been doing is cutting off the seed heads to prevent it from spreading via seed. Generally, we're doing this before the seeds are mature, though. So once the seeds are all fluffy and ready to go with the wind, it becomes really difficult to manage it, because you could risk doing more damage than good, because you're sending the seeds everywhere every time you touch it. So we've mostly done it right sort of right before the seeds matured. So we would cut them off, we would bag up the seed heads, and then we would practice that selective dry land cutting and remove the stalks from the site, and then the township would come and take our seed heads for us. And just this, so we've cut it now, I think, for 2 years, so 2019 and 2021. And we have started to try this sort of revegetation option. We've been adding some native shrub species to the area to try to take up some space and take up some resources from Phragmites. And so this is a picture of the same spot, and it looks a little deceiving because it's taken at a very different time of year. But you can see in the first year on the left here, the Phragmites was really dense. It was a very large, multiple trailer loads of Phragmites that we had pulled out of, or had cut out of there. And this is the regrowth from early, I want to say 2021. So you can see there is it's certainly less abundant. A lot of it did grow back, but that's just a testament to the fact that we're not going to solve this problem. That frag has been there for years. It didn't get there in a day. It's not going to take us one day to get rid of it. And the whole revegetation idea, planting shrubs, etc., that's important, because nature does not leave vacant space. Nature will never leave vacant space. As soon as there's a premium on vacant space, as soon as it's available, something else will move into there. And often it's other invasive species. So we're trying to sort of halt that progression there and put something in its place before either Phragmites comes back or something new decides to move in. So the last sort of big part of my presentation tonight is about reporting invasive Phragmites. And this really has to do with that Phragmites campaign that Susan mentioned at the beginning. So why would you want to report invasive species and Phragmites? So this includes like reporting it anywhere. It could be on your property, it could be on a roadside, it could be in a provincial park, it doesn't matter, anywhere. Is because it helps inform control and management. They're currently talking about some sort of provincial Phragmites strategy. So having this data available, should that strategy ever happen, would be really valuable. They'd know where Phragmites already was, and they'd be able to, it would help them figure out how they're going to control and manage it. It also allows for early detection and rapid response. So in really key priority areas, reporting where maybe it's a high value bog or a high value fen, being able to report that early would allow land managers to react really quickly. And so how would you actually report it? Well, there's a couple of ways. So one main way is using EDDMapS Ontario, which I'll talk about in a second. There's both an app and a website, or you can call the invasive species hotline and report it via phone as well. So EDDMapS, it's basically a web-based monitoring system. So EDDMapS stands for Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System, and this is the Ontario version of it. So it's a really easy to use tool that doesn't require you to have any fancy GIS experience or anything like that. It's very, very straightforward to use. It was launched in 2005 at the University of Georgia, and the Ontario one was launched after that, funded in part by the Canadian and Ontario Invasive Species Centres, Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, as well as the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. And basically what it does is it documents the presence of invasive species. So it's a really simple, interactive sort of web map interface that enables people or users to submit observations of invasive plant species. And then the data is widely available to everybody, to researchers, to the average, from researchers to the average person. And users enter their information about invasive species through a very simple form that I'll show you in a second. And then staff at the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters do review observations before they're made sort of publicly available to everybody. That's just to make sure that what people saw is actually what they saw. So when you go to EDDMapS Ontario, the first thing you would want to do is you'd want to register or make yourself an account, which is very simple. It's just like you would make any other accounts. You need your email and your name and things like that. And then what you can do is you can go to report sightings. So if you click on report sightings, it comes up and it says, okay, well, what type of species do you want to report? And we're going to pretend we're reporting frag. So we'd say, okay, we're going to report an aquatic plant. It may show up under terrestrial actually too, but so you can find it that way. And this is what the form looks like. So you'd select the pest from the drop-down menu, which would be Phragmites. You'd say when you saw it. You'd say what habitat you saw it in. And only the red fields are required, so you don't need a ton of information, but the more information you do give them, the better it is. You can even give them the percent cover, the abundance. You can talk about what stage of the life cycle the plant is at. So is it in flower? Are there seeds? Is it dormant or dead? And is there any damage to it? You can actually zoom straight in on this map. I found this the handiest part, and I put the screenshot here just to show you. So you would zoom in to wherever you were, and you would click this little like marker. It almost looks like an upside down raindrop here, and drop it on the map where you are, and it will automatically fill in the latitude and longitude for wherever you are. And you can include a description of the nearest address as well if you think that might be helpful. And then you can include images. So they ask that you try to take at least 2 digital images. Again, not required, but it certainly helps with them confirming and verifying that it actually is what you think it is. And you can easily upload them via this tool. So then you would submit your observation and wait for it to be reviewed. And I'm not entirely sure of what the timeline is for review right now. I think it can fluctuate quite a bit. So just be patient, but it will pop up there. And the other thing I wanted to talk about too, so that's for actually physically reporting it, but you can also see where there have been verified cases of an invasive species in your area. So to do that, you'd click right here on distribution maps, and you'd select from a list what species you want. So this is just sort of a snapshot of Phragmites observations in and around sort of the Puzzle Lake Provincial Park area, stretching from Depot Lakes to Tweed. And you can actually see, if you click on a point, you could see the details of that, the date, and sometimes even a photo of what it looked like. So that's very handy. And then over here, you can see in the legend, you might also see points that are different colors. So this is what they mean. So negative, it was a negative observation. Positive means that it was confirmed. That's what it is. Some also have treated or eradicated, and those you don't see as much. I would say the vast majority of points that you see are the red positive ones. So that's a really handy tool. Okay, and so I hate to be the bearer of bad news and bring in a different species. I know this is a Phragmites focused talk, but I saw a talk years ago where the presenter had said, I worry that this grass that silvergrass is going to be the next Phragmites. And it's really starting to hit home now, because I panic a bit when I drive, anywhere now really, and see this grass that people have planted that's starting to creep into ditches and creep down roadsides and things like that. So this is a new invasive species from, and it doesn't have a best management practice, I don't think yet, but it does have sort of information about it online. So there's about 10 different Miscanthus species. They're introduced as ornamental, and you can see why. Like they're tall, they have these really distinct kind of silver white flowers and seed heads, and they're just absolutely stunning, but they spread really aggressively via those underground rhizomes, those underground stems, and it outcompetes native vegetation, forming really, really dense mats. And it does really, really well in shoreline. So I wanted to include this just as a reminder that we're always seeing new invasive species. And, I know these things are so beautiful, but if you check out OntarioInvasivePlants.ca, they have what they call their Grow Me Instead guide. And so you can actually look for species like this, like Miscanthus, which is included in the updated version. And it'll give you other recommendations for other really wonderful native species that you can plant in place of them. And finally, I always like to finish with what can you do? So the first thing always being to learn more, and that's exactly what people are doing here tonight. And thank you so much for doing that. And then to learn what invasive species are and be able to recognize them. Again, exactly what you're doing by attending tonight. Think about how you are contributing to spreading invasive species. Are you rinsing off your canoe after you go paddling in the river? Are you brushing off your boots after you go hiking? Now, ask yourself those kind of questions. And then practice prevention. So once you've identified how maybe you are contributing to the spread of invasive species, how can you stop? How can you stop it? Report them using EdMaps Ontario or the Invasive Species Hotline. And then if you have them on your property, take a look at those best management practices and think about a way to start to manage them. And I included a picture over here of a really great guide that I really love and I've referred to many times. It's called A Landowner's Guide to Managing and Controlling Invasive Plants in Ontario, and you can find that as a PDF freely available online. And then finally, attending one of our in-person events. So for sure, we are going to be having our Beaver Lake Phragmites control event this year. It was a public event back in 2019, and we've done it just as the board for the last couple of years because of the pandemic, but we're hoping this year for October 2nd to be at Beaver Lake and working on that population again. And we will likely have one other event that Susan will keep everybody apprised of our possible location and date for that. So get out there, learn more about it and get your hands dirty at one of these in-person events. And yeah, I just wanted to finish by, again, thanking everybody for coming tonight and for participating in our Phragmites campaign. I'm hoping that we will see lots of points popping up on EDMAPS from the Salmon River watershed, but also from beyond. If you're from outside the Salmon River watershed, please report Frag. It doesn't matter where the reports come from. Every report will make a difference. So thank you.
All right. Yes. I just wanted to, we will get to, of course, the Q&A section in just a moment. I'd like to actually thank Amanda first before we get on to the Q&A. Okay. And and also there are two other organizations I wanted to thank, and those are the Invasive Species Center, of course, for funding our Phragmites campaign. Without that money, it would be hard to be doing what we're doing. And also thanks to Quinney Conservation, because they have been a big help with us with our social media posts about the reporting phase and about this webinar. So Amanda, thank you so much for a very thorough presentation on Phragmites, which is certainly something we all need to know a lot more about, especially if we want to help preserve our wetlands. And after all, wetlands are some of the most important parts of our watershed, of any watershed. It was great to know how widespread the impacts are on all species. And in fact, of course, including insects and pollinators, again, some of our most important species. I thought it was really interesting that Amanda pointed out that development on shorelines can actually promote the growth of invasive species. And of course, that really just points to the fact that we have to be ever more vigilant in protecting our shorelines to be sure that we're not going to ruin some of our very best habitat. So thanks a lot again, Amanda, especially for taking the time to teach us all this, because I know darn well when you're putting together a presentation, you're probably doing it all at like 10 o'clock at night after all your regular field work and so on.
Yep, guilty, yeah.
Absolutely. So that's great. Thanks very much. And we will get on to the Q&A.
Excellent. Again, yeah, thanks, Amanda. That was a very comprehensive presentation, despite Phragmites being in the chat as either Frank my knees or Frank ladies.
I know, I knew that would happen. It doesn't.
Oh yeah,
like,
we were laughing about that. I think everybody was able to follow along fairly well. I think you mentioned that Phragmites was from Europe. Is there anything that controls it? Where it came from?
Well, so where it came from, it would be native. So it doesn't necessarily behave, for lack of a better word, as invasively where it's native to. It has other plants and things that keep it in check there that it, naturally evolved with, whereas it doesn't have that here.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I mean, is there any research being done on control measures like bug insects that would, attack it or anything like that?
There is. There absolutely is. And I think it comes out of, don't quote me on it, but I feel like it's the University of Toronto. I did some site visits actually at one of our NCC properties. They were trying to decide whether or not it would be sort of a suitable populate area to like release a biocontrol for Frag, which I think is a moth. And I haven't really heard anything from the researchers recently, but I know that biocontrol and Frag, they've been talking about it for upwards of 20 years pretty much now. So it's definitely in it's definitely being researched, absolutely.
I know biocontrol is a bit of a slippery slope because you start with
Yeah.
insects and then you import birds and then, I mean, you end up with lions. Because
Yeah, no, I agree, but I mean, purple loosestrife though is a great has really been a good example of biocontrol, I think, being effective. It's never going to, we're never, I think, you know, we have to remember we're probably never going to get rid of invasive species. We just have to keep the populations at bay. And yes, when they first released the beetles to eat purple loosestrife, there were times where the populations were so great that they did start eating native loosestrifes as well. But eventually it brought things down into check, and it really has done a good job, I think, at least, keeping the numbers more reasonable.
Mhm. Right. One of the questions was, is there any research if there can be any beneficial use from Phragmites after they are cut down, i.e. ethanol? And I just want to insert here that making ethanol from plants is a terrible idea. It typically takes more energy than you get. And I know miscanthus is being promoted in some areas as a biofuel, which will be a disaster if that's allowed to continue. But anyway, is there
Yes,
any
I've
data?
heard about the biofuel idea with miscanthus specifically. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Mhm.
And using an invasive plant in order to put gas in our cars is not a very sensible idea from my point of view. What's the relative, is there any research on the relative frequency between native and invasive Phragmites? Is there twice as much invasive, or, I mean, is there any ballpark on that?
Yeah, I don't know if there's any research about sort of the number or the quantity of each. They do occur sort of throughout their ranges. They both occur together, they co-occur. There has been some research on the two hybridizing though. So, and it had, like, there's confirmed hybridization of Phragmites outside of North America. And there's some isolated cases of it in North America. One of the big things that I was working on a couple of field seasons ago was collecting samples from Phragmites populations that they didn't quite fit either of those descriptions. So either the invasive or the native. There were certain things that just didn't match up in that chart I presented there. So Joanna Freeland was doing some research at Trent about hybridization, and we submitted samples from all of those populations where they looked native, but there was something that was off about it. Either they were missing one of those things, or they were often growing really densely in monocultures, and it just seemed strange. So we submitted them, but they all came back as being one or the other. So there was no evidence of hybrids in that case.
Right. Actually, I just want to let everybody know that John Foster has answered some questions in the chat. So take a look at the chat. And also he has just included information on plant invasives, www.ontarioinvasiveplants.ca. So that's a place, because I was going to ask, where can people get best management practices for various invasive plants?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's actually right at the link John put there. Hi, John. I haven't seen John Foster in what seems like years. So thank you for coming tonight, John. I appreciate that. And hopefully I'll see you soon. But yeah, OntarioInvasivePlants.ca has all of the best management practices there. They have right at the top of the screen, I'm just looking at it right now, they have their sort of new ones highlighted there, new or updated ones. And they have some technical bulletins as well, but then they have the whole series if you scroll down. So everything from wild parsnip to giant hogweed to garlic mustard, etc.
That's excellent. And yeah, thanks again, John, for that. Someone has mentioned in the chat that they see tall grasses growing in the median of the 401. Are those invasive, or are they planted intentionally, or did they just grow there, or do you know?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if I think about the stretch of the 401 between, say, Kingston and Belleville, it would largely be invasive Phragmites that's growing in the medians there. I suspect that it was not planted there. I would imagine it would be a safety issue with the height of it and not being able to see as well. But I imagine it was, my guess, I don't know for sure, but my guess is that it was spread by vehicles, by road vehicles and things like that on the side of the road. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And it's just wetter there too. There's ditches, there's culverts that water all moves through. It's a very disturbed area. So it definitely is invasive Phragmites that you're seeing there.
Do you have any suggestions in terms of revegetation? What plants should be introduced to once you've taken out a patch of Phragmites?
Yeah, sure. One of the sites where we've managed invasive Phragmites for years and have had the most success in terms of revegetation has been with some sort of wetter shrubs. So things like red osier dogwood, for instance, we've had a lot of success with that growing in sites. We've seeded, I'm trying to think of examples of herbaceous plants that we've seeded, things like the Joe Pye weeds, swamp milkweed. Those are all things that seem to have taken really well to planting and have seemed to have grown really quickly. But again, you can refer to that Grow Me Instead guide, and it has so many recommendations there, depending on what, and it depends on what you're looking for. So if you want something that, you know, that is shrubby, or you want something that's going to have lots of flowers, that's what that Grow Me Instead guide really comes in handy to do, is to meet your needs, but also do what's good for biodiversity.
Is there any notion of the role that the climate crisis is going to play in this? Will it make our northern habitat more beneficial for Phragmites?
That is an excellent question, and I don't know. I mean, it's so hard to say. It is so hard to say. Just with the way that the climate, the drastic differences that we're seeing, we're kind of losing our seasons a little bit, especially those shoulder seasons. It's either winter or it's summer. It's hard to say how our native species are going to be able to respond to that. And, you know, the problem is that invasive species really, they have their tolerance seems to be so much wider than a lot of our native species do. So I would imagine they would benefit. They would be the ones, maybe that wouldn't benefit, but we might have other species that would struggle. So it's anyone's guess, but I have my fingers crossed that our native species will hold strong.
Yeah, I mean, that's just another tangent from climate change that is going to change everything to a certain extent.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
If your neighbor has an ornamental patch of Phragmites, I mean, what should you do other than sneak over in the dead of night and cut it down?
That was actually going to be my suggestion, was to, you know, dress in all black and run over and cut it down. I mean, I think that, and this happens so much, like working for NCC and having nature reserves where we have neighbors, so we can manage all the invasive species that we want on our properties, but there's a hard boundary where we can't be cutting anything down. And, you know, it's my dream that Frag would realize where the parcel boundaries are of things, but it doesn't. So it's going to keep moving, right? And so I think like education really is the main thing that you can do. Phragmites is a restricted species. It can't be sold in garden centers and things like that. So just reminding them, you know, showing them some of there's, you know, 1-page little handouts you could print off and give to them, leave in their mailbox or something like that, highlighting, you know, maybe your neighbor has a patch of Frag, but they love to watch birds at the bird feeder. You could highlight how Frag negatively impacts birds. Try to find something that they like that Phragmites negatively impacts. And honestly, it's probably not that hard because the negative impacts of Frag are so widespread.
Well, that's very good advice. Yes, find out something they like and then link the negative impact of Phragmites to that. Super.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that pretty much does it. But again, thanks a lot. As usual, I learned a lot, and it's just very cool.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone again for attending, and John for all of your advice to everybody in the chat. Appreciate it.
That's great. Thanks again, Amanda, for such a comprehensive presentation. And what you're seeing now on the screen is the crew from 2019 at Beaver Lake after we'd finished cutting down the Phragmites, and we're all saying, yeah, we got rid of that Phragmites. at least today we did. And just to remind you that I will get back to everyone confirming a date and time for the Beaver Lake fieldwork. And also everyone who is registered tonight will of course get a link to this recording. And I will also make sure and send you the online resources of, for instance, the best management practices and the EDD maps and anything else that is relevant from tonight. So thank you so much, everyone. It was great to see lots of people and so many people obviously involved in wanting to preserve our wetlands.
Go out and find some Phragmites.
Go out, yeah. If you feel like it, go out and find some Phragmites and cut it down. Thanks so much, everybody. Good night.
Good night.